Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the Russian ruble, because the Russian ruble has strengthened significantly in 2025. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I've said on many occasions that the strength of a currency is intrinsically linked to the strength of an economy. When your economy is doing well, then usually lots of companies and countries want to trade with you. Therefore, there will be demand for your currency. And when demand goes up, it tends to push the price up. And it's the same with currencies. So when there's strong demand for your currency, it means that the value goes up. So that's why, generally speaking, if your currency is doing well, it means that usually your economy is doing well. However, that isn't the situation in Russia. But let's have a look at what's been happening to the ruble, and then we'll go through the details as to why this is now causing major problems for a lot of the largest companies in Russia. But before we get into all of that, I'd just like to ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button, because it's not really a subscription. You're not actually subscribing to anything. You're not going to actually pay me anything, but it does help me with the algorithm. And also, most importantly, it helps to put a smile on my face and to keep me going making these videos. So please hit that button if you haven't done so already. But if we have a look at this chart, it shows the movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the past 12 months. And you can see that at the start of the year, in January, the 1st of January, the exchange rate was sitting at $1 to 114 Russian rubles. However, we've seen a huge strengthening in the ruble in 2025, and currently $1 is exchanging for around 78 rubles. Now that represents an increase in value of around 40% in the rubles. So you would have thought, given what I said at the start of this video, that means that the Russian economy has strengthened massively in 2025. But if you've been following my videos, you'll know that it's actually the opposite situation. The Russian economy is currently struggling. It's seeing a reduction in the growth of its GDP, and it's coming under a lot of pressure in terms of the ramping up of the sanctions over the last few months. We recently saw Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, being hit with direct sanctions. And the three biggest customers, India, China and Turkey, are now pulling back from dealing with Russian entities. So Russia is actually going through a world of pain right now. So you would have expected the value of the ruble to be falling dramatically, but it isn't. It's going in the opposite direction. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, the ruble is dying as a currency because not many countries want to actually trade in rubles. The biggest trading partners that Russia has, China, India and Turkey, don't want to deal in rubles, and India and China aren't doing that. China will only deal in its own currency, Chinese yuan, and India is trading with Russia using United Arab Emirates because Russia refused to deal with Indian rupees, so they're going for a middle ground currency between the two of them. So the demand for rubles isn't going up, even though there has been demand for Russian oil and some gas. So we've lost the linkage between the currency and what's happening in the economy. But also, we've got a situation whereby the Russian central bank were instructed by the Kremlin to start protecting the value of the ruble. So we've got a much smaller market. International market now is significantly less than it was historically for the Russian rubles. And that makes it very much easier for the Russian central bank to control the value of the ruble. So they can step into the markets and buy rubles and support the strength of it. So that's one of the reasons why the currency has traded to the current level where it is. And if we have a look at what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that before the war in Ukraine started, the ruble was trading at around about 75 to 1 US dollar. So we saw a crash in the value immediately following the invasion. We then saw that bouncing back to around about 50 to 1 US dollar. That was because the Russian central bank was protecting the value. And then over the past 3 years, we saw the value drifting down to that level we talked about earlier at the start of 2025, around 114. However, in this year, the Russian central bank has been strengthening the value again back to where it was before the war started. But the current strength of the ruble isn't actually helping the majority of Russian businesses. Now, Russia is the largest country in the world geographically. It's got more land than any other country. And within that land, there are lots of different commodities. So, obviously, we know about oil and gas and coal, but it's also mining a whole lot of other stuff. And it grows lots of food because it's got so much space. So, it is an exporting nation. That's what the economy is dependent upon, the exports coming out of Russia, which are sold in exchange for cash. Now, if you think about the situation as an exporter, let's talk through two examples. So, if we assume that $1 equates to 100 Russian rubles, if you're selling your product for 100 Russian rubles in the global markets, in that example, it would be trading for $1. So if you were sitting in the USA, you wanted to buy that product, you would have to pay $1 for 100 Russian rubles. When the currency strengthens to 78 to $1, for that same product, if it's still selling for 100 rubles, you would have to pay $1.28. So that means in the USA, it's increased the price by 28%. However, the Russian ruble value hasn't changed. As an exporter, you're still receiving 100 Russian rubles, so your income hasn't moved, but your exports have become more expensive in the international markets. So that's obviously bad news for exporters when your currency strengthens. However, the majority of Russia's exports are not dependent on the price set by Russia. They are global commodities. So things like oil, gas, wheat, coal, there is a global price for that. And that means that Russia just has to accept whatever the global price is in US dollars or euros or United Arab Emirates, whatever it might be. So Russia has to adjust its international pricing to meet whatever the market is telling it to. So what that means as an exporter, when your currency strengthens, it actually reduces the amount of income that you're going to make. So we go back to our example. If the international price for that product, which was being sold for 100 Russian rubles, is $1, if that's what everybody is selling that product into the markets for, it means that Russian companies have to keep selling at $1. When the ruble strengthens from 100 to $1 to 78 to $1, what that means is that the income remains the same. You still get paid $1 for the sale of that product. But in terms of rubles, you're only receiving 78 compared with 100 previously. So that means that your income has actually fallen by 22%. You're no longer getting 100 rubles for the sale of that product, you're only getting 78. So this is why the increase in the value of the ruble is causing so many problems in Russia at the moment, because the majority of the big companies in Russia are exporters. They are selling things around the world. Obviously, they're selling less than they were before all the sanctions were put into place because the West doesn't want to buy any Russian products. But there is still significant demand from places like India, China, Turkey, Africa, those sorts of nations who are less concerned with the political issues of what's happening in Ukraine. So there is still demand for this huge quantity of commodities. However, the strengthening of the ruble has reduced the amount of income that these Russian companies are making because they can't adjust their price. They can't just increase the price of commodities in the global market. Those prices are set globally by the markets, and Russian companies are now reporting lower revenue and lower profits as a result of the increase in the value. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, okay, I understand the situation with regards to exporters, but isn't this good news for importers into Russia? Because it's the opposite situation. If the global price is $1 and previously they were paying 100 rubles, they would now only have to pay 78. So there is a validity in that argument. But the problem that Russia has is twofold. Firstly, it's a majority exporter. It's a net exporter. So it exports more than it's importing. So that means that in terms of balancing its accounts, it's losing more than it's gaining. But also, because of the sanctions that have been put into place, Russia is actually struggling to be able to source all of its imports. So previously, it was importing lots of things from the West, particularly Europe, because Europe is on its doorstep. So it was doing lots of trade with Europe. It can't do that trade anymore. And so Russia has had to turn to the grey market, the parallel market, the black market, whatever you want to call it. So it's having to find things like Apple iPhones, as an example. If it wants to import lots of iPhones, it can't do it from Apple. It can't place orders in the USA. So it would need to go through a secondary source to import those iPhones. And going through the black market or a parallel market is much more expensive. So importers aren't really benefiting from lower costs because they found the cost of imports actually going up. And also, as I said earlier in the video, not many countries want to be paid in rubles. So you can't just hand over 78 rubles for that $1 product because nobody wants them. So what you'd have to do is convert those rubles into dollars or euros or Chinese yuan, and therefore you're losing on the exchange rate, and also you're paying those international higher prices for things that you can't buy through legitimate sources. So this is the reason why Russian companies are now struggling as a result of the strengthening of the ruble. At face value, it looks like good news. It looks like Russia is doing really well because of the old adage of strong currency, strong economy. However, that relationship has been broken in Russia, and the current strong value of the ruble is actually detrimental to the Russian economy. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking a lot about the Russian economy, and I think one of the most popular topics over the past few years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine is what's happening with the Russian ruble. And as we saw earlier in the video, immediately following the invasion, we saw a collapse in the value of the ruble. It was trading for more than 120 against the US dollar. We then saw this remarkable turnaround when it went to its strongest level for over 10 years. Basically supported by the Russian central bank, so it was an artificially high level. And then over the last 3 years, we have seen the value drifting back above 100. However, President Putin was very unhappy with that 100 to 1 US dollar scenario because from a global perspective, it looks like Russia was weakening in its international trade. So he wanted to get it back below 100 and instructed the central bank to do that. So we've now got a situation where it's trading for less than 80. So at face value, it looks like Russia is doing well again. But what we've talked about in today's video is that we have now seen a complete break in the relationship between the ruble and the Russian economy. And the reasons for that are multiple. But firstly, nobody wants to deal in rubles. So demand for rubles isn't linked to demand for Russian products. Secondly, Russia is facing a whole wave of sanctions, so it can't freely trade with the rest of the world like it used to. So that means that the demand for ruble is already much smaller than it had been historically. And then thirdly, the Russian central bank is actually supporting the value of the ruble artificially. So it's not a managed currency as such, but effectively it is, because the Russian central bank steps in and makes sure that it only trades in certain parameters. So I think that's a good explanation as to why the ruble has strengthened by around 40% in 2025. But in today's video, I wanted to go through the implications of that, because it's one thing having a strong currency and saying, look at my currency, isn't it doing fantastically well? That means Russia is totally unaffected by any of these sanctions. But it's another thing when you've got all of the CEOs of the main Russian companies coming out and complaining because they were all expecting the ruble to be trading for around about 100 against the US dollar. That's what most Russian companies included in their budgets at the start of this year. However, because it's now trading around 80, they're having to report all of their results in rubles. So they're exchanging all the money that comes in into rubles, and that's causing them major problems because, as I said earlier in the video, they're not setting the price of their products in the international markets. If they were, then we would have seen all of their prices going up as the value of the ruble strengthened. All of their exports would have become more expensive. However, you simply can't do that, because when a global price is out there, you can't say, well, I'm going to sell at 10% or 20% above the global price, because nobody would buy your product because it's a commodity. That's the whole point. That's the definition of a commodity. It's something that's not really differentiated. It's not branded. It's not like buying Nike sneakers or an Apple iPhone where you want that particular brand. If you're buying oil or wheat or gas or coal, You don't really care where it's coming from to a certain extent. Obviously, there's slightly different variants in terms of all of those different products, but generally speaking, coal is coal, oil is oil. So if Russia increases its price by 20%, as it would have had to because of the increase in the value of the ruble, then nobody would buy it. But in addition to that problem, Russian companies are also facing problems as a result of the sanctions. So they're actually having to sell their products below the market price. So oil's a great example. Currently, we're seeing reports that Russian oil is trading for anywhere between $30 and $20 per barrel, compared with the market prices of around $60 per barrel. So Russian companies aren't even able to sell at the global price. They're having to undercut the global prices in order to persuade countries like China and India and Turkey to continue taking the risk of dealing with them. So we've got an absolute nightmare from Russian companies' point of view, because they're having to report in rubles. They can't do trade with all of the companies and countries that they wanted to because of the sanctions that are put into place. They're now having to sell their products below market price. And then they're converting all of that currency back into rubles for their annual reporting. So this is wiping out a huge amount of profit from a lot of these companies. And actually, many of them are now returning losses in Russia. So the overall summary of today's video is that the ruble has strengthened in value in 2025 by around 40%. And ordinarily, that would have meant that the Russian economy had probably increased in value by 40% if you're looking at a direct relationship. However, the direct relationship between the currency and the economy is completely broken in Russia. There is no longer a link. And the strength of the ruble is actually causing major problems for a lot of the big Russian companies. And the longer this situation continues, the worse it is going to get. So this is yet another factor that's causing major problems in the Russian economy. And unless President Putin is happy to let the value of the ruble drift out above 100, this will continue. And if you look at what's happened in 2025, it looks like it's a cosmetic exercise to show that Russia is doing well. But unfortunately, that cosmetic exercise is causing real-world problems, cash flow issues, and profitability losses for the big Russian companies. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that. Thanks very much. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through YouTube membership or Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you so much for that support. It really does help to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.